Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com, and I just want to talk about why prohibition is such a bad policy. Okay, and I mean, when I talk about prohibition, I don't mean just about outright banning of, let's say, drugs or sex work. I mean anything. Prohibition can happen at several levels. So yes, there is the policy of just outright banning the provision and consumption of a good or service. But there are other ways it can achieve the same result by making provision or consumption of that good or service very, very, very difficult. Okay, an example, guns and immigration. Okay, and basically you end up having the same result. The idea is if it becomes impossible to get a good or service legally, or really, really hard to get a good or service legally because you have to file paperwork and wait for a permit, and then the permit only gets granted to you if some bureaucrat feels like it, and that also opens the door for that bureaucrat saying, hey, I'm only going to grant that license if someone has the right relationship or gives the right bribe, etc. It opens up the door to corruption. Okay, and getting that good or service, which can be really, really problematic when we're talking about things like medical marijuana, where basically oftentimes people who are on the verge of death are waiting and going through a long, long process to get something to help them deal with the pain in an end-of-life situation. And then to add insult to injury, then it gets heavily taxed, making it more expensive at a point in life when they're generating a lot less income than they were before they were in that position. So it's just very cruel when you put it into perspective. But the end result is typically the same, that those who cannot get it legally, some will choose, like people who are just kind of like and on the fence. The marginal consumers probably will just not get that stuff. So they won't buy drugs, they won't, patron prostitution. Again, but those are very few. People who are sort of consumers who have, very much value this good or service, they're just going to go get it anyways. But they're going to go get it in a shadow market. Okay? A market that operates outside of the standard legal framework that society works under. And that creates some really big problems. One, generally entrepreneurs who are willing to provide a good or service in the shadow market, they don't have the legal system to protect them. So if you're a standard business and basically someone decides to not pay you for your goods or services or tries to steal from you, you have the benefit of the standard legal system. You can call the police to come help you out in your situation. You can take people who break a contract to court. There's no such thing in shadow markets. If you're an illegal drug dealer or anything dealer, there is no court, there is no police you can call. So in that case, you have to be judge, jury, and executioner. And what happens, you end up having, this is where you end up with organized crime, very violent organized crime in the provision of these goods and services. Okay? So you end up increasing violence, you end up increasing criminal activity, and that can oftentimes have impact in the poorest neighborhoods the most, as far as the kind of violence that increases in the streets, the kind of perpetual sort of cyclical poverty that it creates. It's going to affect those neighborhoods the worst. Okay, on top of that, you're going to have a lack of quality control. So what happens is when something is provided legally, you can easily go look at competitors. And it's easy for modern news media and normal outlets for information to tell you, okay, this is a good provider, this is a bad provider. And if some provider provides something that's so dangerous that it kills you, they're going to be hit with lawsuits through the legal system. That's going to result in them being shut down. It's going to result in PR. That's going to result in them getting shut down. There's a lot of accountability in sort of more transparent, open markets. Now, so then what happens in the sort of illegal markets for drugs, immigration, etc., you end up having a lot less quality control. So what happens is with drugs, you end up having overdoses more often because there's no way to really know what the quality of the drugs are. And oftentimes you're lucky if you know sort of one person who can provide you that good or service, so you're not really shopping around because it's not like really like there's a listing of where they get this stuff. and there's not really like a Yelp where you can see reviews. There's not a legal system where you can take someone to court if they sell you something that does real harm. There's none of these provisions, none of these sources of accountability that exist in legal markets. So you end up having more overdoses. You end up having the good or service that you think may be causing harm is causing more harm. Okay, so we've increased crime and violence. We've increased the harm of this good or service that society views. And at the same time, you've just also wasted a lot of resources from the legal economy in the form of taxes, because you're paying for enforcement, you're paying for incarceration, and those have other costs, because when you're incarcerating lots and lots and lots of people, okay, that's a lot of people who are not with their families, those are a lot of people who are not part of the labor force. You create this sort of, and then what happens is those people become systematically part of that systematic poverty, because those convictions that may be for a non-violent crime, just as maybe smoking a joint, now they're not able to, it's harder for them to get a job, it's harder for them to participate in civil rights of theirs, whether it's voting, etc., just are taken away from them. And at the end of the day, if someone can't vote, politicians don't cater to them. That's just the way it works. So then what happens is that these people who are, basically, if you're someone who's a victim of prohibition, there is no incentive for politicians to cater to you, because you can't vote, because you've been convicted of a non-violent crime. Or you're someone who is basically, as far as treatment of convicts and whatnot, there's no reason for any politician to care how they are treated, because they're not part of the voting population. When someone's not part of the voting population, they can become the scapegoat. They can become the one that becomes the absorber of all mistreatment, of all, what's the word I'm looking for, where they're not giving them the attention that they otherwise would. Okay, so this is why prohibition is a very bad policy. This is why who has access to the voting booth does matter as far as how politics plays out. But at the end of the day, we want less things solved through politics. Ideally, the less politics matters, because the less decisions it makes, the less that dynamic matters, the less who can vote matters. Okay, and then also the less these systematic problems come to existence, because once politics creates a systematic problem like this, a systematic poverty, something like that, systematic disparities, it's really hard to reverse them, because it's really hard to create or shift the gears of politics, because it's about trying to build a very large consensus. So point is, prohibition is just a really bad policy. It creates really bad consequences, and it's not just drugs. Whether you're making it really hard to buy guns, whether it's sex work, which is subject to outright prohibition, whether you're making it really hard to immigrate, you're going to see the same dynamics that I just talked about. These dynamics exist in all of these areas. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Go check out alexmerced.com if you'd like to learn more or hear more of what I have to say. You can also check out libertarian101.com. And if you want to learn more specifically about economics, go to learneconomicsnow.com. Thank you very much.